Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman. And this is Global Insight. This week, the Otago Daily Times has been criticised for publishing a cartoon that belittled the suffering of the Samoan people in the current measles epidemic. The ODT has apologised for its lapse of judgment and for the hurt caused. Let's use this unhappy incident to throw a light on New Zealand's relationship with Samoa and with the other Pacific Island nations. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Bruce.
A number of Samoan commentators, in talking about the cartoon and the measles epidemic, have linked it to New Zealand's role in spreading the Spanish flu to Samoa in 1919, a deadly flu that wiped out 20% of that nation's population. Have we forgotten some of our history in the Pacific? Is it still affecting our relationship with Samoa?
I think we should never underestimate the power of historical memory. And I think, you mentioned the episode of 1919 when a New Zealand passenger ship, the Tulane, docked. It was in November 1918, and passengers which were affected by influenza were allowed to go into Samoa from the docked ship. And that caused a pandemic, an influenza pandemic. 22% of the Samoan population died as a result of that. And that clearly, the administrator at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Logan, a New Zealander, came in for a lot of flack. The same ship, the Tulane, had docked at Fiji, but did not allow any of its passengers to go on board there. So that threw a bit of a shadow, and obviously that was a bad backdrop for New Zealand's administration of Samoa by the League of Nations between 1920 and 1935. And on the 28th of December 1929, there was another episode in which I suppose affected or reinforced negative perceptions amongst some Samoans of New Zealand. And this is when an opposition resistance group in Samoa got into a violent confrontation with the New Zealand police there, which resulted in 11 Samoans dying and one New Zealand police officer. And it was that checkered history which led Helen Clark in 2002, when Prime Minister, during a visit to Samoa, to apologise on behalf of New Zealand for past errors in administration. So yeah, I don't think we can underestimate these perceptions, and of course they have intercepted with the episode which you've just referred to, the cartoon that appeared in the ODT. And so I suppose it's touched a bit of a raw nerve from Samoa's point of view, recent events.
How important is it for New Zealand to have a strong relationship with Pacific states?
I think it's very important. Since the 1970s, particularly since the UK joined what's now called the European Union, 1973, New Zealand has diversified its foreign policy. And as part of that diversification, the Pacific has loomed very large. Why? Well, I think there's three crucial reasons why the Pacific has become very, very important to New Zealand. One is geography. It is simply New Zealand's backyard. And although we often think of ourselves as a small state, in comparison with the 22 Pacific Island states of that region, we're almost a superpower. Australia, of course, shares that geography with us and is even more powerful than New Zealand. But nevertheless, it's one of those areas in New Zealand's foreign relations where, unusually, we are considered a regional great power. And in addition to that, we shouldn't forget about the demographic links between the two countries. Many people of Pacific origin now live in New Zealand. If you take a place like Tokelau, which currently has 1,500 citizens, there are 7,000 people from Tokelau living in New Zealand at present. And it's projected by 2026, the size of the Pacific population in New Zealand will be something like 10% of the total population. So there are real people-to-people demographic links. And thirdly, there is a political and constitutional dimension to New Zealand's linkages with the Pacific Island states. We have constitutional responsibility for the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau. So yeah, I think those three factors together mean that the Pacific Island states loom quite large for New Zealand decision makers.
We often think that we are viewed by our Pacific neighbours as the good guys, especially compared with Australia. But is that correct? How are we viewed by Pacific Island states?
On the whole, it's difficult to generalise, but I think New Zealand's stance on a number of issues have made Pacific Islanders have quite a positive perception of New Zealand. Particularly in relation to Australia, I think there's one underlying factor and there's one recent factor which have contributed to that perception. I think the underlying factor is that compared with Australia, New Zealand is seen as a much more credible, independent foreign policy actor with relatively few axes to grind. And what I mean by that is that Australia is seen by many of the Pacific Island states, particularly after its involvement in peacekeeping in places like Bougainville and East Timor. In comparison to New Zealand, Australia is seen as much closer to the United States, a little bit more heavy-handed and patronising in its dealings with Pacific Island states. In contrast, New Zealand peacekeepers and indeed New Zealand diplomats generally have been praised for their professionalism, cultural sensitivity and the ability to improvise, that is to adapt to local circumstances. So that's, I think, the general factor working in favour for New Zealand in the region. The specific factor which I think has catapulted or risen dramatically in significance is that New Zealand, compared with Australia, has been much more responsive to the number one problem facing the Pacific Islands and climate change, particularly the problem caused by climate change, which is the rising sea levels. And I think this government in particular, Jacinda Ardern, has won a lot of plaudits in the region because this government has said that climate change, has identified it as one of our fundamental challenges globally. And I think that's gone down well. It shows, from Pacific Islands' point of view, it shows an ability to empathise. And let's be quite clear, we have a vested interest in trying to combat the effects of climate change in the Pacific Islands, because if some of these countries become uninhabitable, that is, sea levels rise to a point where countries cease to be as they are currently, then many of those people will expect to migrate to New Zealand. And it's interesting the contrast between New Zealand and Australia on this issue of climate change. Scott Morrison has problems actually conceding there is such a problem. And many Australians have drawn unfavourable comparisons between their own Prime Minister and that of New Zealand Prime Minister. I don't think there's any room for complacency, as we've seen with this recent episode, the Garrett Tremaine cartoon, which has led to protests and some strong feelings being articulated. So I'm not suggesting that New Zealand's got it totally right. I'm just saying I think that it has all the potential to deepen the relationship with the Pacific and make it a positive one.
Thanks, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Tofa so'ifua.